which is basically blowing the American experiment out of water. You know, a lot of people say the span from East Coast to West Coast has been one of the greatest experiments of time, but basically in order to assimilate, to come to the United States and be a member of this great experiment, you basically have to assimilate into the American culture and language and so forth. Whereas you had Rome, and although Hellenic was, you know, widely used amongst many of the people, you did have different cultures and different languages being used, yet
being unified under a Roman Greco
administration.
In other words, it became a Greco-Roman world.
Exactly.
In other words, I think what Father John is saying in this book is the Latins who founded the city of Rome, I mean the Romans who founded the city of Rome, were a branch of were a Latin tribe.
Yeah.
They were one of the tribes of the Latins who founded a city that they called Rome. And this city basically had a Hellenic culture. This particular group of Latins, not all the Latins became Hellenized.
No.
This particular group of Latins who founded the city of Rome were Hellenized. They adopted, I mean, I remember in junior high school, when we did the Greek chapter, then we went to the Roman chapter, the gods were the same, but they just changed the names. From, you know, Zeus became Jupiter.
Right.
You know, and
From Zeus Pater, yeah.
Dionysius became Bacchus. You know, some of the names weren't even changed. So they wore togas. They had columns with a triangle on top for their buildings. You know, they had some variations in architecture, but almost nothing. Maybe they invented the aqueduct. They had basically the alphabet, or the Greek alphabet. They did some variation on it. So basically, the city of Rome was a Greco-Roman city, and that these now Romans went and conquered the whole world with the Hellenic culture. And when they actually came upon the ancient Greeks, they basically just assimilated with them and incorporated them into their empire that grew and became enormous. So it was really
That's why in what the West calls later Byzantine times, the actual language of the Roman Empire, which was called Romaic.
Oh, so in other words, the Byzantines didn't say that they spoke Greek.
No.
They called their language
Romaic,
even though we would call it Greek.
Yes.
Even though it is Greek. They didn't call themselves Greeks.
No, and they called the language they spoke Roman.
They called their language Roman.
Nor did they call themselves Byzantine either.
Back a little further, before the term Byzantine came up, the Roman Empire in the East, as Father John in this book explains, when the Franks conquered the western half of the Roman Empire, they came up with a label for the rest of the Roman Empire that they hadn't conquered yet. They hadn't conquered really the vast and most powerful and most wealthy part of the empire, which was in the East. The Roman Empire that was free and still an independent empire, they came up with a new name for it, a label for it, which was Greek. They started calling it Greek, and they started calling themselves the Romans. Why would they pick the name Greek, Michael? I mean, what was the point of the Franks? First of all, what was the point of
because by the time they had conquered, Greek had come to mean, in the popular vernacular, pagan and heretic.
So they were, in other words, they were calling the Romans heretics.
Yes.
In other words, to try and maybe claim that they weren't really Romans.
That's right.
Because to be a Roman was to be a Christian.
That's right.
To be a Greek was to be a pagan. So to call somebody a Greek was it was a great insult, more than an insult. It was to call them a heretic.
Yeah.
So Charlemagne, who was the great father of the Franks, was the one who began this great lie of calling the Romans in the East the Greeks, and then later the term Byzantine.
And it's also ironic to know why they would tag this classification of being Greek, you know, connotating heretic, is basically for staying steadfast in the Christian faith as it was to that point. Basically, it was a sour grapes way of saying you're not accepting our innovations, therefore, and they basically started displacing the bishops of the areas.
Well, displace, I think, is too kind of
What word would you use, Michael?
Torture and murder would probably be a far more accurate.
A purge, a
purge.
Stalinist type purge. They came in
and in fact, they divided the spoils. They gave the control of these various bishoprics to their buddies, their conquering
fellow warlords. And set up castles
and they wholesale moved the populations out of the cities into the countryside. They built walled fortresses to keep them in, and they created the beginnings of the feudal system.
So the feudal system in Western Europe, this is what really blew me away. This is really, because up until then, I never really could understand when I was a kid in junior high school, thinking, you had these masses of serfs working in the fields, and you had this one guy in his family living in this beautiful castle. How did he get in that castle, and who helped him build it?
Right.
You know, how was he able to get the masses of the people to allow him to be in this position? You know, we were never taught that there was basically a conquering army that had come in and set up the system, and that these people were basically what was left of the free Roman Christians that were now being enslaved on really slave labor camps, which is really what life was like in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, like living like a slave. Really slave labor camps set up by the Franks, and you had the bishops, on the one hand, who were former Frankish warlords, keeping the people in fear of going to hell. And on the other hand, you had the Duke and his knights keeping the people from going in fear of going to hell sooner than they really will be if they just live a normal life, which at that time was maybe 30 or 40 years, and then you were dead.
And that's how these popular terms like villain, i.e. the person that lived in the villa, which was the name of the slave labor camp, became the villain. And the word Frank, which,
honest and straightforward.
came to mean everything positive. In fact, you think about, we get the word franchise, i.e. to be made free from the word frank.
To become a Frank.
To become a Frank.
In other words, if you were a Roman, you were still without your franchise. You
That's
were still
right.
not a Frank, and you were still a slave.
And the same term is also applied in America as well in the earlier days of our nation with slavery as well.
Because people talk about the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages didn't happen accidentally. The Dark Ages were dark because the Franks wanted them dark. They wanted education. They literally wanted to obliterate an indigent culture, to destroy all traces of the Roman Greek culture from the conquered people.
Well, things, but why did the Franks want to obliterate all traces of Roman?
Because there were repeated
Orthodox
there
Christianity.
were repeated rebellions and there were repeated revolutions. There were repeated attempts by the oppressed people to throw off their Frankish warlords. And these were aided and fomented by that part of the Roman Empire which was still free.
Constantinople.
Yes.
in other words.
And also at the fall of Constantinople, now that you mentioned Constantinople, it's interesting, hopefully my memory serves me correct, when the emperor at the time, Constantine Palaiologos, the city was basically falling, collapsing around them, and assistance was being offered from the West, of course, with the one condition that he basically subjugate himself to the West and the Western Emperor and the Pope.
And adopt the Frankish religion.
Exactly, and he basically refused that, saying that he'd rather live X amount of years under the Islamic rule, the Ottoman rule.
Well, I think the expression is better we wear the Turkish turban than the Frankish tiara.
Absolutely, that's where it comes from.
Better,
Which shows you the
better Turk
magnitude,
than,
right.
Better Turk than Frank.
Right. It shows you the magnitude of what a Roman at that time thought.
Becoming a Frank, how horrible that was.
Absolutely.
It's the same pattern after the Khmer Rouge conquered in Cambodia. They moved everyone out into the
Out of the cities,
countryside,
into the countryside.
and they killed all the intellectuals, and
Cambodia went into Dark Ages.
they went into the Dark Ages. It was the same pattern. It was the same obliteration of a culture.
That's interesting.